Lastly, but of course not least, we have Emily Kuhlmann, Making Visible Bodies, Artistic Interventions of Recognition and Responsibility. Emily Kuhlmann graduated cum laude from the University of California, Irvine, with a BA in art history and a minor in women's studies. Her research interests include critical race art history, queer theory, and performance. Currently, she is the curatorial assistant at the Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco.
Imagine you are walking in the Lower East Side of New York City. As you cross the sidewalk lining Tompkins Square Park, you see a leg kick from behind a parked car. Taking further interest, you examine the scene to see a black man crawling down the street in a black suit carrying a potted plant. A white videographer documents William Popel's movement as he silently drags his body across the asphalt on a hot afternoon in his performance, Tompkins Square Crawl. Suddenly, a black resident of the neighborhood approaches the scene. Confronting both of the men, the resident demands to know what's going on. This performance occurred in July of 1991. In the presentation of this performance, the audio of the altercation is often not included with this video, but accompanies it as a transcript. The dialogue displayed here has been adapted from multiple publications. Considering this transcript, Tompkins Square Crawl asks us what it means for artist, participant, and audience to be accountable for what they see. Tompkins Square Park acts as the anchor of Alphabet City in the Lower East Side of New York. Situated between Avenues A and B, this park has a deep history of social activism. Stemming from protests in 1874, Tompkins Square Park has been a site of political unrest. Even in this early period, marches were organized following unemployment and other effects of financial recession. The multiple communities that have resided within these couple of blocks have had a legacy of taking action against oppressive police forces. Social demonstrations were again agitated at the turn of the 1990s. The continued disinvestment and abandonment of the neighborhood occurring in the 70s and 80s led to a population of homeless people and community of anarchists to take residence in Tompkins Square. Detailing the environment and local residents of the Lower East Side, documentary photographer Q Sakamaki captured the conditions and lived experiences of this community. This threat of gentrification, combined with low-income housing shortage, was exemplified by the transformation of Christodora House. Originally intended as a community building, with a public gymnasium, pool, music school, and settlement housing for immigrant families, this building was eventually turned into condominiums in 1986, with the penthouse selling for a grand total of $1.2 million. After the active displacement of homeless populations from squatter buildings and the tent city of Tompkins Square, people took action to protect the public space. This neighborhood created political interventions to protest this gentrification and physically removed people from experiencing homelessness. With gentrification came hostility from police, who began to put stricter demands on the area. After a May 1st demonstration and riot, police evicted 150 people living in the park on June 3rd of 1991. This was done in order to forcefully close the park over a 14-month period for cosmetic renovations. The protest presents almost as a precursor to the more recent Occupy movements occurring in these same spaces. These were the conditions that performance artist William Pope L. responded to in the summer of 1991. He began this crawling piece in Times Square. On hands and edging along with the push of his knees, Pope L. crawls along the asphalt in a black business suit. With similar intention, he does the same thing at Tompkins Square Park, but all while carrying an orange potted carnation. By spectacularizing movement on the street, he makes people notice the street as a place in which people reside. Pope L. inserts subjectivity back into a homeless population that is more comfortable and easier to ignore. Pope L.'s movements become choreographed and carefully considered as he sacrifices his body in order to move. Pope L. endures the threat of dirty needles, bacteria, and sharp objects as he exposes his body to abject harm. This unclean space suggests that it is an improper place for human existences. Pope L.'s performance therefore absorbs the setting's abjection and the experiences of poverty as abject. Pope L.'s sweating and straining body presents a disturbance to order. As the U.S. population invests in systems that are assumed to help people, such as the Department of Social Services, Child Welfare, and Department of Health Services, this performance challenges the efficacy of such systems by recognizing that some individuals are still not protected. The viewer is not allowed to read the physical existence of people living on the sidewalk as neutralized and normalized in this performance. However, Pope L.'s movement is not mimicking the usual movement of a homeless population about the city. Significantly, Pope L.'s performance aptly signals the political and social struggles of homelessness without reproducing existing tropes. Mixing and matching incompatible visual symbols, such as wearing a tailored black suit and dragging his body through the gutters, Pope L. complicates how we read homelessness. Tompkins Square Crawl suggests a number of different questions that one must consider. What happens when this symbolic act is interpreted differently than the artist intended? What happens when this interpretation of the piece becomes a part of the piece? And what happens when this interpretation is in conflict with the actual performance of the piece? It is in this altercation with the resident that poses these questions. The immediate outrage of the resident, seen here in a blue shirt, is initially directed to the videographer. His anger then turns to Pope L as he recognizes him as the orchestrator of the piece. Fraught with the heightened tension of gentrification in the neighborhood and the perceived racial oppression, the resident's anger rises. Confusion gives way to his realization that crawling down the street is a purposeful portrayal of a black man. The abjection of poverty then becomes even more potent as the resident's anger escalates when he finds identification with Pope L. Explain what? You running around the street like this in a goddamn suit? I wear a suit like that to work. Brings the resident's concern from a community level to a perceived personal insult. Pope L's performance is then understood at a new intimate level. With both the resident and Pope L using the suit as a uniform for their labor, laying down and crawling up to the white man equates to what the resident does for a living. In this performance, the identification between artist and audience and the intersectional understanding of both race and class are unable to be ignored. By enhancing the visibility of homelessness through the dramatized embodied performance of Pope L and the rhetoric of artistic practice, community members, like the resident, could read the performance as reproducing and mocking the conditions of homelessness and racism that exist in that community. Both Pope L and the resident have aligned concerns with race, homelessness, and the perversion of power. emphasized by Pope L's desire to discuss and go and have a Coke. However, the ethical responsibilities and limitations of Pope L's performance remain. Even with this offer, the resident and the artist display different investments. This is displayed by the fact that the symbolic act is not read as an actual solidarity with the reality of the neighborhood. It is in this moment of interruption, of engagement, that challenges the assumed responsibilities of viewer and artist. In the resident's challenge to the authority of Pope L, and in effect halting the performance, the resident demonstrates how we are responsible for what we view. We are responsible for what happens in our communities. We are responsible to what we see walking down the street, and we're implicated to what we are witnesses to. This performance provides a model for how both artist and participant are able to take responsibility for their actions. After Tompkins Square, Pope L has had to change his practice in order to accommodate his experience. Breaking one of his original rules of silence, conversation and exchange have become central to Pope L's practice. His later crawls encourage dialogue with audiences, and that he will stop and explain to viewers if they initiate an interchange. William Pope L has since created group crawls with an example seen here. With safety in numbers and the sanctioning of an organized event, these group crawls remove ambiguity. However, it is important to consider the different conditions between Pope L, Tompkins Square Park, and his other crawls, such as his 2002 piece, The Great White Way. In other renditions of these crawls, resonances of homelessness are not as overt. As Pope L crawls up Broadway, moving through Manhattan end to end, this piece, in comparison to Tompkins Square, suggests motifs such as the pressures of success, masculinity, and progress, as Pope L inches along the street wearing a Superman costume with a skateboard strapped to his back. The playfulness of this performance suggests a very different tone, and gone is the possibility of identification. The political stakes of homelessness that were apparent in the Lower East Side have not necessarily crossed over into these other performances. Tompkins Square Crawl asks us, what investments do we have in ignoring social conditions of poverty and racism? What interests do we have in maintaining and regulating social stratification? What role does the artist have? What responsibility does the artist have in presenting these conditions? And when examining artwork, what responsibility does the audience have to both the performance and these considered social conditions? Thank you.